She walked into that building knowing exactly what they thought of her. She had heard it with her own ears, 3 meters behind them, in that cold marble hallway in Seoul. The words hanging in the air like something that could not be taken back. The Korean mafia boss. One of the most powerful and feared men in all of East Asia. A man who controlled billions. A man whose name made entire rooms go silent. He had said it casually, the way people say things they believe so completely they never think to question them. That he would never marry a black woman. That it wasn't his world. That it wasn't something he would ever consider. And she, a 22-year-old black woman with honey skin and long blonde curls, and a mind so sharp it had kept his entire empire from collapsing without him ever knowing her face. She had heard every single word. She didn't cry. She didn't turn around. She didn't leave. She straightened her white blazer, adjusted the strap of her bag, and walked directly into that conference room, sat in the second most powerful chair at his table, and spent the next 40 minutes dismantling 12 years of his organization's financial structure so completely that grown men couldn't find a single word to argue back with. He sat at the head of that table, and for the first time in his life, Jang Min-jun could not look away. He had already decided who she was before she ever walked through the door. He had no idea what was coming for him. Before starting the story, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click Join to become a member and help our channel. There are moments in life that do not announce themselves. They do not arrive with thunder or ceremony. They do not give a man time to straighten his collar, prepare his expression, or arrange his face into something that resembles composure. They simply happen, quietly, without permission. And by the time a person understands what has just occurred, the world has already shifted beneath their feet, and there is no version of standing still that will ever feel the same again. Jang Min-jun had never been a man who was caught off guard. He had inherited a criminal empire at 34 years old, stepping into the chair his father had occupied for 2 decades with the kind of cold precision that made even the eldest men in the organization stop talking when he entered a room. He had reorganized 3 divisions, dismantled 2 rival factions, and restructured the entire financial operation of the Hyuk-yong syndicate within 8 months of assuming control. Not with rage, not with inherited authority alone, but with a methodical intelligence that most people in his world never expected from a man who had grown up watching violence from the doorway of a back office in Itaewon. He was not cruel without reason. That was the thing people misunderstood about him. He was precise. And precision, in a world built on fear and loyalty and paper trails that could not exist, was more dangerous than cruelty ever would be. That Tuesday morning, he sat at the head of the long marble table in the 42nd floor conference room and read the quarterly financial report that his assistant had placed in front of him without a word. The rain outside moved slowly against the glass in long diagonal lines. The city below was already awake, cars moving through Gangnam like dark water through channels. But up here, in this room, there was only the sound of the report's pages turning and the faint hum of climate-controlled silence. He turned to page 11. He read it once. Then he read it again. Then he set the report down with a flatness that his assistant knew better than to interrupt, because that particular flatness meant that something had surprised him, and surprises were not things Jang Min-jun processed quickly or publicly. The financial architecture on page 11 was unlike anything the syndicate's internal team had produced in the 8 years he had been monitoring their output. It was not simply clean. Clean was easy. Clean was expected from anyone who understood basic money movement and had access to offshore structuring. This was something else. This was a system built with a kind of layered intelligence that accounted not only for what regulators would look for today, but for what they would look for 3 years from now when the regulations shifted. Whoever had built this had not been solving a problem. They had been thinking forward into problems that did not yet exist, and solving those too. He looked at the name attached to the work. Layla Voss. He said nothing out loud. He rarely did. But somewhere beneath the surface of that controlled expression, something registered. Not admiration yet, not anything that clean, but a first small crack in the certainty he carried about how things worked and who was capable of what. He called for Pak Tae-young. His second-in-command entered the room the way he always did, slightly too quickly, slightly too eager, the energy of a man who had been waiting outside the door rather than sitting comfortably somewhere else. Tae-young was loyal, efficient, and perpetually nervous in a way that Min-jun had long since stopped finding irritating and simply accepted as part of the furniture. "This report," Min-jun said, not looking up. "Page 11. Who built this structure?" "Layla Voss, sir, the American analyst. She has been working remotely for just under 2 years. Her previous contact within the organization was Director Shin, before he passed." Min-jun turned the page back, read a line again. "No one here has met her in person." It was not a question. Tae-young answered it anyway. "No, sir. She has operated entirely through encrypted channels. No video. No in-person meetings. We have a verified identity file, but no one in this building has seen her." Min-jun closed the report. "Change that. The restructuring summit next week? She attends in person." Tae-young nodded and turned to leave. And that was where it began. Not with a declaration. Not with any decision that felt significant in the moment. With a closed report, a name on a page, and a man who believed, with the complete and unexamined confidence of someone who had never been wrong about people, that he already knew exactly what kind of person Layla Voss would turn out to be. He did not know. He could not have known. Because no one had told him what walked through a door when Layla Voss decided to enter a room. And that was the first mistake. The hallway outside the 42nd floor conference room had a particular quality of silence that only exists in places where powerful people have said things they should not have said and trusted the walls to keep the secret. The walls, as it turned out, were not the only ones listening. Park Tae-young walked out of the conference room with the quiet efficiency of a man executing an order, and somewhere between the closing of that heavy door behind him and the turning of the corridor toward the elevator bank, he found himself walking beside Han Sung-woo, one of the syndicate's older operational directors, a thick-necked man in his late 40s who had survived 4 leadership transitions by being useful enough to keep and careful enough never to be threatening. They were not friends, but they were the kind of colleagues who had shared enough closed rooms and enough unspoken knowledge to fall into conversation the way water falls into a low place, naturally, without deciding to. "The American is coming in person," Tae-young said, his voice low, the way voices get when a man is not trying to be secretive, but simply does not feel the need to be loud. "The boss wants her at the summit." Han Sung-woo made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a scoff, but lived somewhere in the territory between the two. "I heard she's black. American and black." Tae-young gave a small shrug. The shrug of a man acknowledging information he does not know what to do with. Apparently. The boss know that? I don't think it came up. Han Sung-woo adjusted the cuff of his jacket with the particular self-satisfaction of a man about to say something he considers insightful. Well, you know how he is about that. Remember what he said at the Busan meeting? That he'd never seriously involve himself with a woman like that. Never marry one. Said it wasn't his world, wasn't his type, wasn't something he'd ever consider. Taeyong said nothing, which was, in its own way, agreement. They were almost at the elevator. Neither of them had looked back down the hallway. Neither of them had any reason to. And so neither of them saw her. She had come in through the secondary entrance on the east side of the floor, the entrance that guests used when they arrived before the main reception desk was staffed, which, at 8:47 in the morning, it was not. She had taken the elevator up alone, had been directed by the building's internal security system, the same system she had helped restructure remotely 14 months ago, and had walked into that hallway with the quiet certainty of a woman who had memorized the floor plan before she ever set foot inside the building. Layla Voss stood 3 meters behind them. She had been standing there for 11 seconds by the time Han Sung-woo finished his sentence. She heard every word. She stood completely still. Not frozen. Still. There is a difference. Frozen is what the body does when fear takes the controls. Still is what a person does when they have heard something that lands exactly where they expected it to land, in a place that was already bruised from 100 previous impacts, and they have long since learned that the only response worth giving the world is to keep their face clean and their spine straight, and walk forward as if the bruise does not exist. Layla had been doing that since she was 16 years old. She let the 2 men reach the elevator. She let the doors close behind them. She stood in that corridor alone for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds in which something moved behind her eyes that no camera in that building was positioned correctly to catch. And then she smoothed the front of her white blazer with one hand, adjusted the strap of her champagne bag on her forearm, and walked toward the conference room as if the hallway had been empty the entire time. The meeting began at 9. There were 12 men in that room. 12 men who had spent years inside an organization that ran on hierarchy and reputation and the unspoken understanding that your position at the table told everyone everything they needed to know about your value. 12 men who looked up when the door opened and processed what they saw the way people process things when reality does not match the file they had already built in their heads. She pulled out the chair to the right of the head of the table. Not a middle chair, not a chair against the wall. The second chair, the one that, in every meeting this organization had ever held, belonged to whoever was being given the floor. She sat. She opened her notebook. She looked up once at the room. Not a scan, not a performance, just a single level look that moved across those 12 faces the way a hand moves across a surface to check the temperature. And then she looked back down at her screen and said, with the complete absence of ceremony, "Good morning, Layla Voss. Should I begin?" And the thing that happened in that room in the silence that followed was not dramatic. There was no gasping, no visible reaction, nothing that anyone present would have been able to point to afterward as the moment things changed. But something shifted in the atmosphere of that space, the way pressure shifts before weather. Quietly, completely, and in a direction that could not be reversed. Jang Min-jun, sitting at the head of the table, looked at her. He had expected competence. The report on page 11 had prepared him for that much. He had not been prepared for the specific way competence looks when it sits in a room without apology. He had not been prepared for her. He took one breath, measured, controlled, the breath of a man pulling himself back into the room, and said, "Begin." What followed in the next 40 minutes was the closest thing to a public dismantling that any of the men in that room had ever witnessed without a weapon being involved. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform. She moved through the financial architecture of the organization's current structure the way a surgeon moves through a body. Not with aggression, but with the calm authority of someone who knows exactly what is healthy and what is about to cause a catastrophic failure, and has no interest in softening that information to make the room more comfortable. Two of the senior directors tried to push back. She let them finish. Then she turned her screen toward the table and showed them, in numbers that could not be argued with, exactly where their logic fell apart, and exactly how much it had already cost the organization in the previous 18 months. The room went quiet, in the way rooms go quiet when no one wants to be the next person to speak. Min-jun had not moved from his chair. He was still looking at her. And for the first time in a very long time, Jung Min-jun, the man who had walked into every room of his life already knowing the outcome, did not know what happened next. That feeling was unfamiliar. He found, to his considerable discomfort, that he did not entirely hate it. There is a particular kind of danger that has nothing to do with weapons. It does not announce itself with raised voices or visible threat. It does not leave marks that can be photographed or reported. It moves slowly, the way a tide moves, not crashing, not dramatic, but persistent and directional, and absolutely certain of where it is going, even when the shore has not yet understood that the waterline is rising. Jung Min-jun understood danger in most of its forms. He had grown up inside it. He had learned to read a room the way other children learned to read books, by necessity, by survival, by the understanding that missing a signal in his world carried consequences that could not be walked back. He had built his entire identity around the ability to assess, categorize, and respond to threat before it fully materialized. What he had never been taught, what no one in his life had ever thought to prepare him for, was the specific danger of being wrong about a person in a way that you could not stop thinking about. The summit ended at noon. The men filed out in the way men file out of rooms where they have been made uncomfortable. Quickly, with the focused energy of people who need to be somewhere else immediately, and will absolutely not be discussing what just happened in the elevator. Han Sung-woo left without making eye contact with anyone. Two of the directors were already on their phones before the door closed behind them, the way people reach for their phones when they need something familiar to hold on to. Layla closed her notebook, slid her pen into the side pocket of her bag, and stood with the unhurried movement of someone whose internal clock operated on a completely different frequency than the anxiety that had just emptied the room around her. She was almost at the door when his voice came from the head of the table. "Miss Voss." She stopped, turned. He was still seated, still in that same position he had held for the entire 40 minutes of her presentation. Spine straight, one hand flat on the table, the other turning the silver ring on his right index finger in the slow, rhythmic way that no one in the organization ever mentioned, because mentioning it felt like naming something private that was not meant to be seen. "The implementation timeline you proposed," he said. "You built it assuming full internal cooperation from all three divisions." "I did." "That's optimistic." She looked at him for a moment. "It's accurate. Whether the cooperation is willing or not is a management question, not a financial one. My timeline accounts for the system. Yours is the room, Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile, not anything that simple, but a faint shift in the quality of the stillness he wore like a second skin. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they did not expect to find interesting, and cannot immediately explain why they do. "I'll need you on site for the implementation," he said. 3 months, minimum. I understood that from the briefing documents. Good. She nodded once. Professional, clean, entirely unreadable. And left. He sat alone in that room for 4 minutes after she was gone. He turned the ring 7 times. That evening, something happened that Pak Tae-young would later describe to no one, because there was no version of describing it that did not make him look like a man who had badly miscalculated the temperature of the room he was standing in. Min-jun called him into the office just before 8 o'clock. The city was dark outside the windows. The rain from the morning had returned, slower now, running in thin channels down the glass. "The conversation you had in the hallway this morning," Min-jun said, without looking up from the document on his desk. Before the meeting, Taeyong felt the specific coldness that moves through a person's chest when they realize that something they believed was private was not. "Chef, she was standing behind you." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that has weight. "I need you to understand something," Min-jun said. And now he did look up, and his eyes carried that particular quality of stillness that everyone in the organization had learned to treat as a warning sign. Not because he would raise his voice, but precisely because he would not. "Anything that leaves this office, anything discussed at that level about anyone working inside this organization, it does not reach the corridor. It does not reach the elevator. It does not reach anywhere outside the room it was spoken in. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Get out." Taeyong left. Min-jun stood at the window for a long time after that, watching the rain move down the glass, thinking about a woman who had walked into a hallway and heard something that should have made her walk back out of the building and never return, and had instead walked into that conference room, sat in the second chair, and spent 40 minutes methodically proving that she was the most valuable person in it. He thought about what that required. Not talent. Talent was common enough. Not intelligence. The organization had intelligent people. What it required was something rarer and more specific. It required a person who had been underestimated so many times and in so many rooms that they had stopped waiting for the room to change and had simply decided to become impossible to ignore. He picked up his phone. He looked at her internal contact file for a moment. Then he typed, "Can I call you?" The response came after 40 seconds, long enough that it was clearly a considered response rather than a reflexive one. "You can." The conversation that followed lasted 42 minutes, and it began as business the way certain conversations begin as one thing in order to quietly become something else entirely. She answered his questions about the implementation with the same clean precision she brought to everything, and he listened the way he always listened, completely, without interrupting, storing everything. But somewhere around the 20-minute mark, the questions shifted without either of them formally deciding to shift them, the way a path in the dark curves without a sign. He asked where she was from. She said Atlanta. He said he had only ever been to the United States for meetings, New York, Miami, Los Angeles, and that all three had felt like places that were performing themselves for an audience. She said Atlanta was not performing anything for anyone, and that was either its greatest quality or its greatest flaw, depending on what you were looking for. He found himself wanting to ask which one she thought it was. He did not ask, but he wanted to. And then he said the thing he had not planned to say. because Chung Min-chun did not say unplanned things, which meant that what came out of his mouth in that moment had been building pressure somewhere below the surface of his composure for longer than he would have been comfortable acknowledging. "You heard what was said in the hallway this morning." A pause. Shorter than the one before his first message. Sharper. "Yes." "I'm sorry." Another pause. And then her voice came back with something in it that was not quite anger and not quite hurt, but was the specific quality of a person who has learned to be very precise about what they give access to, and is currently deciding how much access this moment has earned. "You said it, Min-chun. Not them." He did not deny it. He could have constructed a defense. Context, timing, the version of himself that existed before he had seen what she was capable of. He was good enough with words to build something that sounded like an explanation. He chose not to. "I did. When I was a man who sorted people into categories before he had any right to. Before I sat in a room and watched someone dismantle 12 years of financial structure in 40 minutes. That doesn't erase it." "No," he said. "It doesn't." The silence that came after that was different from the previous silences. It had a different texture. Not empty, not hostile, but the particular quality of a silence in which two people are both still present, and neither has decided to leave. Then her voice, quieter. "Good night, Min-jun." The line went dead. He sat in the dark of his apartment, the cities spread out below him like something that belonged to him in every way except the one that had just become relevant. And he turned the ring on his fingers slowly, steadily, in the rhythm that meant he was thinking about something he could not yet solve. For the first time in a very long time, that did not feel like a problem he wanted to walk away from. It felt like the beginning of something he did not have a category for. And that, for a man who had a category for everything, was the most dangerous feeling he had ever had. There are things that happen inside organizations built on silence and loyalty that never make it into any record, any file, any conversation that could be used as evidence of anything. They exist only in the quality of how people look at each other across rooms, in the specific way a man's posture changes when a particular person enters his peripheral vision, in the small and unannounced adjustments that begin occurring in the architecture of daily life when something underneath the surface has fundamentally shifted. The 3 months of Layla's on-site implementation began on a Monday. By the 3rd week, every person on the 42nd floor had noticed something they could not have articulated precisely, but understood instinctively. The way people who live inside closed systems develop a sensitivity to atmospheric change that functions almost like a second nervous system. They noticed that the morning briefing reports were now placed on 2 desks before any others. They noticed that when she spoke in a room, the man at the head of the table did not look at his phone, which was something he did with literally everyone else. They noticed that she was the only person in the building who could walk into his office without his assistant checking first. Not because she had been granted that access explicitly, but because at some point the assistant had simply stopped intervening. The way people stop intervening when they understand that the intervention would be unwelcome. What no one noticed, because it was not the kind of thing that could be seen from the outside, was what was happening in the space between them when no one else was present. It was not dramatic. That was the thing about it. There were no declarations in those early weeks, no moments that could be pointed to as a beginning. There were late evenings in the office when the rest of the floor had emptied and they were both still at their respective positions, working in the particular companionable silence of 2 people who have discovered that they do not need to fill space with noise to feel comfortable in it. There were conversations that started as operational and became something else in the way that water becomes steam. Not through a single moment of transformation, but through the slow and steady application of heat until the state change becomes inevitable. He brought her coffee once. He did not announce it or make anything of it. He simply set it on her desk as he passed. The specific order she had given to the building's internal kitchen on her first day, which he should not have known, and which she did not ask how he knew, and kept walking without breaking stride. She looked at the cup for a moment. Then she looked at the door he had just walked through. Then she looked back at her screen and kept working. But her hand, when she reached for the cup, was not entirely steady. It was in the fourth week that everything that had been building beneath the surface was forced, violently and without warning, into the light. The alert came through the internal security system at 6:14 in the evening. A flag on an outgoing data transfer that the new monitoring architecture Layla had installed had been designed specifically to catch. Not the old system. The old system would have missed it entirely, which was precisely why it had been missed for however long it had been happening before she arrived. By the time Min-Jun received the notification, Layla was already in the system, already tracing it, already moving through the data with the focused speed of someone who had built the labyrinth and therefore knew every turn without needing to look. The emergency meeting was called for 7 o'clock. The 12 men filed back into the marble conference room, the same table, the same rain against the same glass, and the atmosphere was nothing like the first meeting. The first meeting had carried the tension of discomfort and surprise. This meeting carried something older and heavier, the specific tension of a closed system that suspects it has been penetrated and does not yet know where the wound is. Eyes moved. That was the first thing. In a room full of men trained to control their expressions, the eyes still moved. Small, involuntary assessments, each person in that room quietly calculating who in the space around them was capable of what was being described. And then, without announcement, without theater, every eye in the room moved to Layla. She was the outsider. She was the American. She was the one who had arrived 2 years ago as a name in a file and materialized 4 weeks ago as a person. And she was the one who had built the new financial architecture that the breach had moved through. The accusation was not spoken. It did not need to be. It existed in the angle of every face in that room, in the particular quality of the silence that formed around her the way water forms around an obstacle. Naturally, completely, with the total conviction of something following the path of least resistance. Han Song-woo, who had never fully recovered the confidence he lost in the first meeting, was the one who finally gave the silence a voice. "The breach came through the new system," he said, looking at the table rather than at her, which was its own kind of cowardice. "The system she built. The access points she created." The room did not agree out loud, but the room did not disagree either. Layla sat with her hands flat on the table in front of her. She did not look around the room. She did not perform innocence or outrage or any of the emotional responses that the moment seemed to be waiting for. She looked at her notebook, open to a page of her own notes, and she was quiet for exactly the length of time it took her to decide that she had given the accusation sufficient acknowledgement and would now respond to it on her own terms. She opened her laptop. She turned the screen to face the table. "The breach originated from an internal IP address," she said, and her voice had that quality it got when she was angry. Lower, slower, more precise. The way a blade gets more dangerous the thinner it becomes. "It came from inside this building. The access was made at 3:47 in the morning on Tuesday. I was in Busan on Monday night. I checked into the Park Hyatt at 9:18 p.m. I checked out at 7:45 a.m. on Tuesday. The hotel has camera footage at both timestamps. 3 people in this organization saw me at the Busan meeting on Monday evening. I can name all 3 of them. She paused, looked at the room. I traced the IP. I identified the access point. I know which terminal it came from, and I know whose credentials were used to authenticate the session. The silence in the room changed quality completely. It was no longer the silence of accusation. It was the silence of a room full of people who have just realized that the ground beneath the person they were accusing is significantly more solid than the ground beneath themselves. Would you like me to show you? She showed them. The name that appeared on that screen landed in the room the way a heavy object lands in still water, with an impact that sent everything outward in all directions simultaneously. Han Sung-woo's chair made a sound against the floor. 2 men stood up without deciding to. Someone's phone clattered against the marble table. And in the subsequent chaos of that room, voices rising, accusations redirecting, the entire architecture of the meeting collapsing inward and rebuilding itself around a completely different center. Layla closed her laptop, placed her pen in her bag, and stood with the same unhurried composure she had carried into every room she had ever entered in that building. She did not look at Min-jun, but she felt him looking at her. She walked to the door. She put her hand on the frame. And then, because she was 22 years old and had spent her entire life being underestimated in rooms that thought they had already decided what she was, she allowed herself one thing, just one, before she walked out. She looked back at the room, not at Han Sung-woo, not at the men still processing what had just happened to the certainty they had walked in with. She looked at the room itself, at the marble table, the rain-covered glass, the city burning quietly 42 floors below. And she let herself feel, for exactly 1 second, the full weight of what it meant to have walked into this building as a name on a file, and to be walking out of this moment as the reason the organization was still standing. 1 second, then she walked out. Min-jun found her 20 minutes later in her office, the city spread behind her through the window, her coat already on, her bag on her shoulder, the desk cleared in the way a desk looks when a person has made a decision about something. "You're leaving," he said. "The contract term ends in 4 days. I'll finish remotely." He stepped into the room, closed the door behind him. "Layla." She looked at him, and he saw in her face, for the first time, the thing she never let rooms see. Not anger, not triumph, but the particular exhaustion of a person who has spent years being extraordinary in spaces that kept trying to make her feel like she needed to justify her presence. He crossed the room, stopped 2 feet from her. And Jung Min-jun, the man who had never asked for anything in his life, who had inherited an empire and taken everything else, who had walked into every room he had ever entered already knowing where he stood in front of her with nothing calculated in his expression for the first time that she had ever seen. "I have been wrong," he said, "about more things than I can account for in one conversation. But I am not wrong about this." She looked at him for a long time. "You know what it cost me to walk into this building," she said quietly. "Not the work. The other part. The part where I heard what you said and walked in anyway. I know. Do you? No, he said. And the honesty of it, the plain, undefended honesty from a man who had an answer for everything, was the thing that finally moved something in the wall she had built over 22 years of being exactly who she was in rooms that were not built with her in mind. Not completely, but I want to. The rain moved against the glass behind her. The city burned quietly below. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that he did not know what was coming, which was, she understood, exactly the right amount of time. Then she said, "Send me the new contract by email." She walked past him to the door, stopped with her hand on the frame, and he felt the echo of that gesture, recognized it, understood that she knew he recognized it. Without turning, "Minjun?" "Yes?" "Next time you have an opinion about someone, meet them first." She walked out. He stood in the empty office for a long time after the sound of her heels faded down the corridor. The champagne bag a ghost of color at the edge of his memory. The scent of something expensive and warm still present in the air of the room she had just left. He turned the ring on his finger. Once. Twice. 3 times. And then, in the silence of that office, with the rain against the glass and the city 42 floors below, and an organization that was still standing because of a woman he had dismissed before he ever gave himself the chance to see her, Jang Min-jun smiled. Not the controlled expression he wore in rooms. Not the cold precision that made men stop talking when he entered. Something real. Something that had not had occasion to exist for a very long time. Because somewhere below, walking through the lobby of the building with her coat buttoned against the Seoul night and her bag held in one hand, Layla Voss was smiling too. Not because she had won, but because she had never needed his permission to be exactly who she was. She had simply needed him to finally open his eyes long enough to see it. And some lessons, she knew, were only learned the hard way. The best ones always were. You didn't lose your glow. Your skin lost what it needed to create it. You know that skin the Korean characters have? That glow that seems to come from within? It's not genetics. It's not makeup. It's what happens when you give your skin exactly what it needs. In the right order, with the right ingredients. After 45 collagen drops, the skin barrier weakens. Moisture stops holding. But Korean women at 55 still have that skin, and their secret has now been adapted for you. Mature dark skin, Korean method, glass skin in 30 days. Scan the QR code on your screen right now, or tap the link in the description. This is your moment. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever walked into a room where someone had already decided who you were before you opened your mouth and had to choose between walking away or proving every single assumption wrong in complete silence? Have you ever been the person doing the judging and only realized how wrong you were when it was almost too late to make it right? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, redemption, and the kind of truth that changes people from the inside out, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a part of our community and help the channel.